This week's project is actually a subscriber requested project. If you know me from the forums and followed the workshop build, then you'll know that I use one of my gates as a bridge, for shuttering concrete, for building a dam, for shoring up a collapsed trench, a ramp for the whacker plate, a bench, and many other uses throughout the entire build. The gate survived everything that was thrown at it, and I was asked if I could film a video on how I built it. Now I do have to stress that I'm not a joiner, so the way I built it may not be correct, but I do have several of these which are over 20 years old and they're still going strong. Now I got the design from a joiner who's built hundreds like this, so whether it's right or wrong, the gates have lasted many years regardless. Now one further point that I have to stress is that this one is sort of a temporary gate, so I did take a few shortcuts here and there, but eliminating those shortcuts means that you can have one solid long-lasting gate. Also, one of the most important things is selecting the best quality wood that you can find, and by that I mean straight pieces, with few knots and no damage. Unfortunately, with being in lockdown, I had no say in the matter as I had to order it all online, which meant that I had to accept that whatever got delivered was what I had to work with, and some pieces just weren't that great. Now this drawing shows roughly how I'm going to build it. It consists of 3x2 for the stiles, 4x2 for the bottom and top rails, and 3x2 for the middle rail, which is passed through the thicknesser to size it correctly. The frame is through Mortice and Tenon and is wedged and pegged for extra strength. The front face is vt+g, which are nailed to the frame as you'll see later. Now of course I'm sure there are better and stronger ways to build these, but I'm happy to build them like this knowing that I have some, in pine, that have lasted over 20 years. And I know some people won't use nails, some people include weep holes, and some people use staggered pegs and fit braces. But as mentioned earlier, the design that I use lasts quite well, and it's a fairly uncomplicated process and I'm more than happy with it. So I started off by cutting the post that the gate will attach to. It's been quite a while since I built one, and I cut the angle on the wrong side, so I ended up having to make another one. I softened the edges on the router table, which also makes it easier to paint and looks more professional. Now this gate is a bit of an experiment to see how much of a difference Cuprinol makes to the pine longevity compared to the other gates which I've used Sikkens. So that's why I ended up taking a few shortcuts, as I wasn't too fussed about the quality. Now the post is really far out at the bottom, so I knew I'd have to scribe it. I'm not after perfection here, but I just want the post to be straight. Next job was to cut the stiles, but they just didn't look square. I realised that my saw wasn't at 90 degrees, so I had to recut after adjusting the saw. Cutting the stiles together gives a better chance of them being the same length. You can see using this test tenon that I cut how it will all fit together. The tenon sits inside the mortise, which is angled at 15 degrees on the outside. When the wedges are glued and inserted, they set inside the mortise to the tenon and create a dovetail effect, which makes separation virtually impossible. The wedges that I cut later are cut across the grain, which isn't ideal, but it works. Cutting along the grain for stronger wedges is much better. But as this gate is an experiment, I wasn't too fussed. Plus, the 20-year-old gate that I already have up in the garden has cross-grain wedges and is still in one piece now. Plus, one of the gates in my garden, which is over 20 years old, was built at the time with cross-grain wedges inserted. So whilst I know they are weaker, I do know that they'll last. To mark out the mortises, I use a template that I've pre-made to suit, and this speeds up marking out. The stiles are quite long and filming it was quite tricky, so I did a little demo of how I cut them on a scrap piece. To get the mortise central, all you got to do once cut is to flip the wood 180 degrees. get the outside angle for the wedges, I use a big wedge to support the piece. Some mortises allow the machine itself to be adjusted. This cheap mortiser is actually really good, but it was damaged by smoke a couple of years back, so it can be quite tricky to use properly as everything is rusted up after the smoke damage and some parts are broken, but it still managed to do the job. But you can see now how everything assembles, and when wedged and glued it's absolutely solid. So the mortises get cut on each end of the stiles. I also need to make the middle rail, which needs to be the thickness of the stiles minus the thickness of the tongue and groove, and again I've got a template for that too. When I reduce the middle rail thickness, I also size up the fillets that I use to attach the tongue and groove later on, so that everything's the same thickness. Then it's a case of marking out the mortise in the middle of the stiles. The tenon on the middle rail isn't cut central like the top and the bottom rails. I also cut a bit of a shoulder on the tenon for a neater finish. Next job is to cut the tenons, but I need a quick tidy up first as I'm starting to run out of room. Now I mark all the tenons together to ensure they all line up for the neatest fit that I can. The next bit is a little bit controversial, as the guard and the riving knife needs to come off. This is the bit that I'm most wary of, and I wouldn't ever suggest taking guards and riving knives off, but unfortunately for me there's no other way on the machine that I can do this. I just need to be extra careful and make sure that my fingers are kept well out of the way. For a neat finish, I cut the shoulder by hand. This tenon's a little tight, but a skim pass down the side of the bandsaw sorts it out with ease. Before gluing everything up, I give it a dry test fit. Now I had filmed the glue up, but the camcorder ran out of battery part way through. But basically, I covered everything in Everbuild's D4 glue, which is advertised as totally waterproof, and I clamped it for a few hours. The fillets were then glued and nailed next, and you can see how it looks here. Then for extra strength in goes the dowels, being careful not to go through both sides. And then it's a case of gluing in the wedges. As mentioned earlier, the wedges are best cut along the grain, not cross grain like this, but with care they'll still do the job. When set, the wedges get sewn off and everything gets a good sanding. Then for a real professional finish, the edges get a round over with a router, as do the fillets. Then to finish off the gate, the tongue and groove is added. Each side of the tongue and groove is trimmed to fit and chamfered on the edges for a neater finish. Then after pre-drilling, each piece gets nailed on with lost head nails. Now this time I opted just for 2 brackets, and after painting the gate it looks quite good. The adjacent gate is about 10 years old, so after a quick sand down this gets a few coats of paint, and after a little adjustment, as the brackets are a little bit different, both gates are now up and they don't look too bad. For a gate that's over 10 years old, the paint's giving it a new lease of life. Then it's just a simple case of adding the hardware, then the gates are finished. Prior to making the videos on YouTube, I worked as a firefighter for nearly 20 years, serving my community and helping to save lives and promote the fire safety message. Unfortunately, an accumulation of many upsetting scenes became too much for my mind to cope with, and after years of failed therapy I was retired from the service on the grounds of ill health and signed off medically from any employment. To keep myself busy, both body and mind, I developed an interest in woodworking and car mechanics, and with already having a hobby in filming and music, I combined my interests and started making videos here on YouTube, filming, editing and composing my own music for my woodworking and car restoration channels Smugwood and Smugwood Mini. Unfortunately, to produce such videos comes at a price, and with minimal funds after being retired from employment, I've turned to Patreon to see if there is additional support out there which could allow me to continue making the woodworking and car restoration videos. In return for support, there are various levels which are explained in more depth at the Patreon link below, but includes the chance to win one of my YouTube projects made throughout the year, and also inclusion into random prize draws open to patrons only. In addition, I'd like to thank everybody who already subscribes to my channels, or watches, comments, likes and shares them, as it all goes to help support my channels, and for that I'm really appreciative. It's my hope that I can continue making the videos for the foreseeable future. Thanks once again for your continued support.